Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Charlotte Gallagher, and today we're joined by our correspondent in Ukraine, Vitaly Shevchenko. Vladimir Putin has been holding his annual economic conference in St Petersburg, talking about Russia's finances. But what is the situation in Ukraine? 4 years into this war, does Ukraine have enough money to keep fighting this?
Well, it's still fighting, so apparently it does. And the reason why it's still fighting, I would say, is because it's found a cheaper way of fighting this war. Unlike Russia, which has many, many more tanks and missiles and aircraft carriers and, really sophisticated kit, which Ukraine doesn't have. Ukraine has found a way of countering all that with much, much cheaper drones, and it's found a way of mass producing those drones and using them against targets within Russia and in Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine. So far, it's been working, even though after Donald Trump's election, the flow of aid from what used to be Ukraine's biggest donor, possibly biggest friend, has dried up.
You talked there about these drones that Ukraine is using, but Ukraine also want from the West these Patriot missile systems. Can you tell us a bit about them and why Ukraine wants them?
They are hugely sophisticated, they are hugely expensive, and they are only made by America. That is the problem. And the reason why Ukraine needs them so much is because, at least according to President Zelensky, Patriot missiles are the only weapon which Ukraine can use to intercept Russia's cruise missiles. Now, cruise missiles are lethal, extremely effective in targeting facilities within Ukraine. Just last Tuesday, when we had this massive airstrike by Russia against Ukraine, 11 cruise missiles were used and they wreaked havoc. So Volodymyr Zelensky is saying, look, we really need those Patriots. Sell them to us. We will find the money to buy as many Patriots as we need. But with what's going on in Iran, America needs those Patriots for itself. And that is another problem. Volodymyr Zelensky says, OK, you can't sell them to us. Give us a license to produce them here. That hasn't been supplied either. So that's why officials here in Kyiv, they say it hurts them to see empty Patriot launchers because they've quite simply run out of missiles.
Do you think there's any chance of Ukraine getting that license in order to produce their own Patriot missiles?
It's a good question, Charlotte. It depends on the moods and the opinions and discussions in Washington. Since Donald Trump came to power, he has been saying repeatedly that he is determined to make this war end. However, a lot of people here in Ukraine and in other countries as well, they're saying that Donald Trump has been putting more pressure on Ukraine rather than Russia. So that's why Volodymyr Zelensky, when he says that, well, give us those missiles or give us a license, he's beginning to sound a bit upset and annoyed.
And Vitaly, what is going on the front lines of this war?
You know, one opinion I keep hearing from people here in Ukraine and analysts across the globe is that at this moment in time, Ukraine is in a pretty good place, in the best position since it launched its counteroffensive against Russia in late 2022. And the main reason for that, I think, is because Ukraine is pursuing two simultaneous campaigns, drone campaigns. One is long range, targeting oil terminals, oil refineries, oil storage facilities, oil infrastructure within Russia. So that puts pressure on the Russian economy and on its ability to find the money to keep fighting. The second Ukrainian drone campaign is medium range, and it's targeting Russian infrastructure closer to the front line and also in the occupied parts of Ukraine. And one sign of how this is working is this torrent of videos we've been seeing from Crimea, which is an occupied region of Ukraine. And these videos are showing enormous lines of cars waiting to find petrol, because these Ukrainian strikes have disrupted the usual supplies of goods and fuel to places like Crimea. So you'd think that this affects not just civilians queuing up to get their petrol, but also Russia's army as well. And it's still sort of creeping forward, the Russian army, but its advance is incredibly slow, incredibly costly, and costly not just in terms of money and lost hardware, but in terms of the number of soldiers Russia is losing. In certain parts of Ukraine, such as Zaporizhia region, Ukrainian forces have started to push back, and they've retaken small villages, but still it gives a boost to the mood here in Ukraine. So in a nutshell, it's sort of static, but Ukraine's feeling upbeat. And
what does that fighting look like?
It's a lot of drones, and Ukraine's way of waging this war. I think it's changed the way wars are fought forever. That is because drones are getting more sophisticated. They are getting longer range as well. So both Russia and Ukraine, they have been hitting their enemy before it can actually get to the front line. That's why you see not just drones flying in the air, but also uncrewed vehicles on the ground supplying the troops that are already there on the front line. They can't get out, supplying weapons and ammunition and food and water to them using other soldiers is extremely dangerous. So both Ukraine and Russia have been using uncrewed ground vehicles, basically robots with wheels. They put the food and ammunition and water in there and just send those vehicles off. And that is, from the point of view of what we saw last year, that is just science fiction, but it's the reality of today.
What else does Ukraine want and need in terms of weapons?
I think the answer to that question is everything. At this stage, I don't think Ukraine will say, look, we've got enough of this, stop giving this to us. It needs money, it needs weapons, it needs political support, anything that it can get out of its allies. Without that support, trust me, Charlotte, it will not be fighting still. And that's why, if you look at the streets of Kyiv, buses running, street cleaners sweeping streets, it's to a huge extent because Ukraine's Western donors are supplying it with money, quite simply to keep Ukraine afloat.
And where is most of that money coming from? Who are the biggest donors in terms of financial aid and also weapons?
Well, like I say, it used to be America. Ukraine's biggest donor, biggest friend, most powerful friend. And when Donald Trump came to power, that all stopped. So Europe tried to fill that huge gap left by the United States. And to an extent, it's worked. Europe is now giving more aid to Ukraine than previously. So far, Europe has given Ukraine twice the amount that Ukraine received from America. So that's money. When it comes to weapons, when it comes to intelligence, it's still America that is unrivaled. That's why no matter how hard Europeans try to help Ukraine, they will not have things like Patriots or sophisticated surveillance systems, and for that, Ukraine still relies pretty heavily on the United States.
That was Vitaly Shevchenko in Kyiv. And if you would like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click the link below. Thank you.